The Alemanni were a confederation of Germanic tribes on the upper Rhine River, first mentioned by Cassius Dio in the context of the campaign of Caracalla of 213. The Alemanni captured the Agridicomates in 260, and later expanded into present-day Alsace and northern Switzerland, leading to the establishment of the Old High German language in those regions. In 496, the Alemanni were conquered by Frankish leader Clovis and incorporated into his dominions. Mentioned as still pagan allies of the Christian Franks, the Alemanni were gradually Christianized during the 7th century. The Pactus Alemanorum is a record of their customary law during this period. Until the 8th century, Frankish suzerainty over Alemannia was mostly nominal, but after an uprising by Theodbald, Duke of Alemannia, Carloman executed the Alemannic nobility and installed Frankish dukes. During the later and weaker years of the Carolingian Empire, the Alemannic counts became almost independent, and a struggle for supremacy took place between them and the bishopric of Constance. The chief family in Alemannia was that of the Counts of Rhaetia Curiensis, who were sometimes called Margraves, and one of whom, Burchard II, established the Duchy of Swabia, which was recognized by Henry the Fowler in 919 and became a stem duchy of the Holy Roman Empire. The area settled by the Alemanni corresponds roughly to the area where Alemannic German dialects remain spoken, including German Swabia and Baden, French Alsace, German-speaking Switzerland and Austrian Vorarlberg. Name. According to Asinius Quadratus, their name means all men. It indicates that they were a conglomeration drawn from various Germanic tribes. This was the derivation of Alemanni used by Edward Gibbon in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and by the anonymous contributor of notes assembled from the papers of Nicholas Freret, published in 1753, who noted that it was the name used by outsiders for those who called themselves the Suebi. This etymology has remained the standard derivation of the term, while Wilfrid Strabo, a monk of the Abbey of St. Gall writing in the 9th century, remarked, in discussing the people of Switzerland and the surrounding regions, that only foreigners called them the Alemanni, but that they gave themselves the name of Suebi. The name of Germany and the German language in several languages is derived from the name of this early Germanic tribal alliance. For details, see Names of Germany. History. First explicit mention. The Alemanni were first mentioned by Cassius Dio describing the campaign of Caracalla in 213. At that time they apparently dwelt in the basin of the Main, to the south of the Chatti. Cassius Dio portrays the Alemanni as victims of this treacherous emperor. They had asked for his help, says Dio, but instead he colonized their country, changed their place names and executed their warriors under a pretext of coming to their aid. When he became ill, the Alemanni claimed to have put a hex on him. Caracalla, it was claimed, tried to counter this influence by invoking his ancestral spirits. In retribution, Caracalla then led the Legio to Traiana Fortis against the Alemanni, who lost and were pacified for a time. The legion was as a result honored with the name Germanica. The 4th century fictional Historia Augusta, Life of Antoninus Caracalla, relates that Caracalla then assumed the name Alemannicus, at which Helvius Pertinax jested that he should really be called Geticus Maximus, because in the year before he had murdered his brother, Geta. Not on good terms with Caracalla, Geta had been invited to a family reconciliation, at which time he was ambushed by centurions in Caracalla's army and slain in his mother Julia's arms. True or not, Caracalla, pursued by devils of his own, left Rome never to return. Caracalla left for the frontier, where for the rest of his short reign he was known for his unpredictable and arbitrary operations launched by surprise after a pretext of peace negotiations. If he had any reasons of state for such actions, they remained unknown to his contemporaries. Whether or not the Alemanni had been previously neutral, they were certainly further influenced by Caracalla to become thereafter notoriously implacable enemies of Rome. This mutually antagonistic relationship is perhaps the reason why the Roman writers persisted in calling the Alemanni barbari, savages. The archaeology, however, shows that they were largely Romanized, lived in Roman-style houses and used Roman artifacts. The Alemannic women having adopted the Roman fashion of the tunic even earlier than the men. Most of the Alemanni were probably at the time in fact resident in or close to the borders of Germania Superior, although Dio is the earliest writer to mention them. Ammianus Marcellinus used the name to refer to Germans on the Limes Germanicus in the time of Trajan's governorship of the province, shortly after it was formed. 98/99. At that time the entire frontier was being fortified for the first time. Trees from the earliest fortifications found in Germania Inferior are dated by dendrochronology to 99/100 AD. Shortly afterwards Trajan was chosen by Nerva to be his successor, adopted with public fanfare in absentia by the old man shortly before his death. By 100 AD. Trajan was back in Rome as emperor instead of merely being a consul. Ammianus relates that much later the emperor Julian undertook a punitive expedition against the Alemanni, who by then were in Alsace, and crossed the Main, entering the forest, where the trails were blocked by felled trees. As winter was upon them, they reoccupied a fortification which was founded on the soil of the Alemanni that Trajan wished to be called with his own name. In this context the use of Alemanni is possibly an anachronism, but it reveals that Ammianus believed they were the same people, which is consistent with the location of the Alemanni of Caracalla's campaigns. Alemanni and Hermunduri. The early detailed source, the Germania of Tacitus, has sometimes been interpreted in such a way as to provide yet other historical problems. In chapter 42 we read of the Hermunduri, a tribe certainly located in the region that later became Thuringia. Tacitus stated that they traded with Rhaetia, which in Ptolemy is located across the Danube from Germania Superior. A logical conclusion to draw is that the Hermunduri extended over later Swabia and therefore the Alemanni originally derived from the Hermunduri. However, no Hermunduri appear in Ptolemy, though after the time of Ptolemy, the Hermunduri joined with the Marcomanni in the wars of 166 to 180 against the empire. A careful reading of Tacitus provides one solution. He says that the source of the Elbe is among the Hermunduri, somewhat to the east of the upper Main. He places them also between the Neristi, whose location at the very edge of the ancient Black Forest is well known, and the Marcomanni and Quadi. Moreover, the Hermunduri were broken in the Marcomannic Wars and made a separate peace with Rome. The Alemanni thus were probably not primarily the Hermunduri, although some elements of them may have been present in the mix of peoples at that time that became Alemannian. Ptolemy's geography before the mention of Alemanni in the time of Caracalla. You would search in vain for Alemanni in the moderately detailed geography of southern Germany in Claudius Ptolemy, written in Greek in the mid-2nd century. It is likely that at that time, the people who later used that name were known by other designations. Nevertheless, some conclusions can be drawn from Ptolemy. Germania Superior is easily identified. Following up the Rhine one comes to a town, Matiacum, which must be at the border of the Roman Germany. Upstream from it and between the Rhine and Abnober are the Ingranus, Intorgi, Vangiones, Caratna and Vispa, some of whom were there since the days of the early empire or before. On the other side of the northern Black Forest were the Chatti, about where Hesse is today, on the lower Main. Historic Swabia was eventually replaced by today's Baden-Württemberg, but it had been the most significant territory of medieval Alemannia, comprising all Germania Superior and territory east to Bavaria. It did not include the Upper Main, but that is where Caracalla campaigned. Moreover, the territory of Germania Superior was not originally included among the Alemanni's possessions. However, if we look for the peoples in the region from the Upper Main in the north, south to the Danube and east to the Czech Republic where the Quadi and Marcomanni were located. Ptolemy does not give any tribes. There are the Tubantai just south of the Chatti and at the other end of what was then the Black Forest, the Varisti, whose location is known. One possible reason for this distribution is that the population preferred not to live in the forest except in troubled times. The region between the forest and the Danube, on the other hand, included about a dozen settlements, or cantons. Ptolemy's view of Germans in the region indicates that the tribal structure had lost its grip in the Black Forest region and was replaced by a canton structure. The tribes stayed in the Roman province, perhaps because the Romans offered stability. Also, Caracalla perhaps felt more comfortable about campaigning in the Upper Main because he was not declaring war on any specific historic tribe, such as the Chatti or Cherish, against whom Rome had suffered grievous losses. By Caracalla's time, the name Alemanni was being used by cantons themselves banding together for purposes of supporting a citizen army. Concentration of Germanic peoples under Arovistus. The term Suebi has a double meaning in the sources. On the one hand, Tacitus Germania tells us that they occupy more than half of Germany, use a distinctive hairstyle, and are spiritually centered on the Semnones. On the other hand, the Suebi of the Upper Danube are described as though they were a tribe. The solution to the puzzle, as well as explaining the historical circumstances leading to the choice of the Agridecomates as a defensive point and the concentration of Germans there, are probably to be found in the German attack on the Gallic fortified town of Vessentia in 58 BC. The Upper Rhine and Danube appear to form a funnel pointing straight at Vessentia. Julius Caesar in Gallic Wars tells us that Arovistus had gathered an army from a wide region of Germany, but especially the Harudes, Marcomanni, Triboci, Vangiones, Nemites and Sedusii. The Suebi were being invited to join. They lived in 100 cantons, from which 1,000 young men per year were chosen for military service. A citizen army by our standards and by comparison with the Roman professional army. Arovistus had become involved in an invasion of Gaul, which the German wished to settle. Intending to take the strategic town of Vessentia, he concentrated his forces on the Rhine near Lake Constance, and when the Suebi arrived, he crossed. The Gauls had called to Rome for military aid. He did not pursue the retreating remnants, leaving what was left of the German army and the dependents intact on the other side of the Rhine. The Gauls were ambivalent in their policies toward the Romans. In 53 BC the Treveri broke their alliance and attempted to break free of Rome. Caesar foresaw that they would now attempt to ally themselves with the Germans. He crossed the Rhine to forestall that event, a successful strategy. Remembering their expensive defeat of the Battle of Vessentia, the Germans withdrew to the Black Forest, concentrating there a mixed population dominated by Suebi. As they had left their tribal homes behind, they probably took over all the former Celtic cantons along the Danube. Conflicts with the Roman Empire. The Alemanni were continually engaged in conflicts with the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries. They launched a major invasion of Gaul and northern Italy in 268, when the Romans were forced to denude much of their German frontier of troops in response to a massive invasion of the Goths from the east. Their raids throughout the three parts of Gaul were traumatic. Gregory of Tours mentions their destructive force at the time of Valerian and Gallienus, when the Alemanni assembled under their king, whom he calls Crocus, who, by the advice, it is said, of his wicked mother, and overran the whole of the Gauls, and destroyed from their foundations all the temples which had been built in ancient times. And coming to Clement he set on fire, overthrew and destroyed that shrine which they call Vaso Galata in the Gallic tongue, martyring many Christians. Thus 6th century Gallo-Romans of Gregory's class, surrounded by the ruins of Roman temples and public buildings, attributed the destruction they saw to the plundering raids of the Alemanni. In the early summer of 268, the Emperor Gallienus halted their advance into Italy, but then had to deal with the Goths. When the Gothic campaign ended in Roman victory at the Battle of Naissus in September, Gallienus's successor, Claudius II Gothicus, turned north to deal with the Alemanni, who were swarming over all Italy north of the Po River. After efforts to secure a peaceful withdrawal failed, Claudius forced the Alemanni to battle at the Battle of Lake Benicus in November. The Alemanni were routed, forced back into Germany, and did not threaten Roman territory for many years afterwards. Their most famous battle against Rome took place in Argentoratum, in 357, where they were defeated by Julian, later Emperor of Rome, and the king Cneidomarius was taken prisoner to Rome. On January 2, 366, the Alemanni yet again crossed the frozen Rhine in large numbers, to invade the Gallic provinces, this time being defeated by Valentinian. In the Great Mixed Invasion of 406, the Alemanni appear to have crossed the Rhine River a final time, conquering and then settling what is today Alsace and a large part of the Swiss plateau. The crossing is described in Wallace Breem's historical novel Eagle in the Snow. Fred Ager's chronicle gives the account. At Alba Augusta the devastation was so complete, that the Christian bishop retired to Viviers, but in Gregory's account at Menda in Lozara, also deep in the heart of Gaul, Bishop Privatus was forced to sacrifice to idols in the very cave where he was later venerated. It is thought this detail may be a generic literary ploy to epitomize the horrors of barbarian violence. List of battles between Romans and Alemanni. 259. Battle of Mediolanum. Emperor Gallienus defeats the Alemanni to rescue Rome. 268. Battle of Lake Benicus. Romans under Emperor Claudius II defeat the Alemanni. 271. Battle of Placentia. Emperor Aurelian is defeated by the Alemanni forces invading Italy. Battle of Fano. Aurelian defeats the Alemanni, who begin to retreat from Italy. Battle of Pavia. Aurelian destroys the retreating Alemanni army. 298. Battle of Lingons. Caesar Constantius Chlorus defeats the Alemanni. Battle of Endonissa. Constantius again defeats the Alemanni. 356. Battle of Reims. Caesar Julian is defeated by the Alemanni. 357. Battle of Strasbourg. Julian expels the Alemanni from the Rhineland. 367. Battle of Silicinium. Romans under Emperor Valentinian I defeat yet another Alemanni incursion. 378. Battle of Argentivaria. Western Emperor Gratianus is victorious over the Alemanni, yet again. 451. Battle of the Catalonian Fields. Roman general Aetius and his army of Romans and barbarian allies defeat Attila's army of Huns and other Germanic allies, including the Alemanni. 554. Battle of the Volturnus. Armenian Roman general Narses defeats a combined force of Franks and Alemanni in northern Italy. Subjugation by the Franks. The kingdom of Alemannia between Strasbourg and Augsburg lasted until 496, when the Alemanni were conquered by Clovis I at the Battle of Tolbiac. The War of Clovis with the Alemanni forms the setting for the conversion of Clovis, briefly treated by Gregory of Tours. Subsequently the Alemanni formed part of the Frankish dominions and were governed by a Frankish duke. In 746, Carloman ended an uprising by summarily executing all Alemannic nobility at the Blood Court at Cannstatt, and for the following century, Alemannia was ruled by Frankish dukes. Following the Treaty of Verdun of 843, Alemannia became a province of the Eastern Kingdom of Louis the German, the precursor of the Holy Roman Empire. The duchy persisted until 1268.